and welcome to the final session this afternoon, or at least the final session before drinks. And my name's Philip Booth. I'm Senior Academic Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs and Professor of Insurance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Luigi Zingales, who's flown over from Chicago for this event today. Luigi is the Robert C. McCormack Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Try getting that on your office door. He's Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a Research Fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research. He's also a Fellow of the European Corporate Governance Institute. In 2003, Luigi wrote with Raghu Rajan a book entitled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, which has been acclaimed as one of the most powerful defences of free market capitalism ever written. In 2012, he wrote a book called A Capitalism for the People, which the Financial Times described as a stimulating essay on the nature of American capitalism and the issues that will determine the pace of America's relative decline. In 2014, Luigi served as the president of the American Finance Association. So, Luigi, as I've just mentioned, one of your major works is called A Capitalism for the People. And in one sense, that strikes the reader as slightly curious, because capitalism is about a free exchange between free people with a relatively small role for government. So from your experiences in Italy in particular, what is a system that you're contrasting with what you might call a capitalism for the people?
Certainly. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you guys to spend a beautiful Saturday afternoon inside here to listen to this. And for all of you here, I'm also a director of the Stigler Center that is trying to sort of analyze what is wrong in many capitalist systems, what is called Crony Capitalism. And on the 4th of July at the Booth School here in London, I will present a program for journalists. You're all invited to attend. Go to Evite, Stigler Center, Chicago Booth. You can see that. But answering your question, I think that many people, not only in Italy, I think throughout the world, see capitalism as a system to make rich people richer. And I think that this is the wrong way to see capitalism. It's definitely the wrong way to sell capitalism. I think that the great advantage of a competitive market system, and I stress the competition aspect, which is crucial, is actually to provide to most people the largest amount of goods at the lowest possible prices. And this is, in my view, is the capitalism for the people. And I contrast that with a system that is sort of for the capitalists, by the capitalists, and in the interest of the capitalists. I think that that's my perception of the system in my native Italy. And unfortunately, what I think is the United States are turning to recently.
And can you give an example in the United States of where big businesses or rich people have explicitly lobbied in order to try to remove capitalist freedoms?
Oh, absolutely. The previous section was about healthcare, and there is much to dislike in UK healthcare, but the US one is even worse in the sense, number one, it costs a fortune. 18% of GDP is spent in healthcare with not particularly brilliant results, I have to say. And the reason is because the system is heavily distorted, as was said earlier. So one example is the fact that there is no free trade in drugs. You cannot re-import from Canada stuff that is produced in the United States and sold to Canada. Why? To enable price discrimination. Drugs are sold in the United States much more expensively than in Canada, and there is a law that prohibits re-importation of medicine. So there is free trade in the United States, everything except drugs. Actually pharmaceutical, because the others are traded all the time. And I think that that's just one example. I was with a researcher who was developing some drugs for arthritis. And I asked, what is going to be the cost of treatment? And he said, oh, we're looking at 30,000 per year. I said, 30,000? I said, absolutely. If we price it less, we're not even considered by the system, because the system is designed to sort of, there are the organization that detects what drugs are used or not. Mm-hmm. They have incentives to basically choose the drugs that are more expensive. So if you come with a lower price, you're not selected. Mm-hmm. So the entire healthcare system in the United States is an enormous distortion that is supported by very strong lobbying by the industry. And on the one hand, I don't want to sound too critical, because there have been a lot of discovery and a lot of fantastic things done by the pharmaceutical industry. However, if you look at how much money they invest in real R&D and how much money they invest in marketing, lobbying, and et cetera, is disproportionate amounts sent in sort of marketing and promoting, et cetera, versus the other. And that's not the right way to do it.
I wonder if you could think about the European Union. Some people think about the European Union as being a marvelous organization which promotes free trade within its borders, just as the United States does within its borders. It stops individual countries putting constraints on migration and that sort of thing, and again, responding to lobby groups to put constraints on migration. But on the other hand, some people look at Brussels and think this is a great field for corporate lobbying. How do you view the EU, and how do you view the Brexit debate in that context?
So the EU has a lot of faces, and I think there is the nice face, which is, as you said, a big area of free trade. I think that the process of integration of markets has been one of the big successes of Europe after World War II, and has been extremely good for all the European countries. And I think that that's the part of the European Union you're going to miss from deciding to Brexit. On the other hand, I think that I never understood why all this was predicated on a ever closer union. I think that that's the part that was scaring the UK. And honestly, that's the part that scares me as well, because a process of unification should be done with the right check and balances. A lot of people are very upset in the United States because of the existence of electoral colleges that give, to some extent, more power to smaller states than others. Wyoming has more cows than people, but has 2 senators like California and the state of New York. However, that system was designed by the founding fathers in the United States at that time to block the overpowering of Virginia, and later it was good to block the overpower of the New York State or the overpower of California. And in Europe, we don't have this system, and I have to say, as sort of an Italian, I feel very orphan of the UK leaving the European Union, because it was a very powerful check in the process. I think that now the European Union is becoming increasingly sort of Germanocentric, and I think it's a danger. I love a speech that Margaret Thatcher gave at the College of Nations in Bruges. Speaking, and she said, sort of bringing Margaret Thatcher to the College of Europe in Bruges is like bringing Genghis Khan to sort of a Christian ensemble. And she said, I'm here next to the graves of 100,000 British soldiers who died to make sure Europe did not get unified under the wrong rules. So unification of Europe is important, but it's not a good by itself, and by itself. It depends on the rules of the game and the balance of power. And I think that, unfortunately, Europe has shown inflexibility vis-a-vis sort of the request by the UK. And so there was a divorce that I think was damaging to both sides.
And I'm just continuing on from that, most of the people in this room are younger than we are. Do you have any...
That's easy.
Yes, that's right. Do you have any degree of optimism for the future? So if you think of a country like Spain, about 10 to 15% of young people actually have a permanent full-time job. Many countries in Europe are in demographic meltdown. Reducing regulation appears to be impossible. In large parts of southern Europe, there's huge amounts of corruption and a very, very large shadow economy. Do you see any grounds for hope, or should all these young people be packing their bags and moving to New Zealand or Australia or Canada or somewhere where there's a bit more hope for the future?
First of all, when you get older, you have to put things in perspective. And when I was your age, guys, half of Europe was under communist regime. And as an Italian, I feared my country would fall under the communist regime. I was living 40 miles from a communist country, fearing invasion from a communist country. So all this stuff is gone. So I think that and the degree of freedom that you have, the degree of access to information that you have, etc., is unparalleled and unthinkable for my generation. I remember sort of trying to get a copy of The Economist was an enterprise at the time, okay? For you, it's hard to imagine, but you have at fingertip everything all over the world. I think that's an enormous opportunity. And the fact that you are relatively scarce in Europe is an advantage. In economics, if you are sort of a scarce good, you earn a rent. And as young people in Europe, you have a lot of potential. Are there challenges? Absolutely. I think that the aging of the population is one. But I tend to be a techno-optimist in the sense that I think technology brings an enormous amount of potential. And I think it's just the challenge is how to direct this technology in the right direction rather than the wrong one. I think that that's a real challenge for you politically, but that's a sort of a challenge that I'm sure you would be able to pick up and win.
Actually, I met somebody last week who lives alone and actually has one of those robots he talks to. So the robots are almost replacing people in many ways. Now, perhaps we turn to the DoddFrank Act, which was passed in the wake of the financial crisis. And a great deal of financial regulation was passed in the European Union, in the UK, and in the United States, and many other countries after the financial crisis. What was the role of business in the passing of that act? Was it lobbying to try to have less regulation, or was business lobbying to try to have more regulation? Because as we know, the DoddFrank Act seems to have actually impeded competition in the financial sector.
So my view is that most of the time, businesses try to get away with having no regulation, especially large business. Once they see that the momentum is in the direction of introducing some regulation, then they are smart. They don't oppose the fight because they know they're going to lose. And so they go in the direction of capturing the regulation completely. So were we in a situation where financial institutions were taking too much risk and something had to be done vis-a-vis that? Absolutely. But once the process started, and I think one of the big mistakes, in my view, of the Obama administration is that they waited too long to tackle the financial reform. So by that time, the banks were already sort of in better condition to fight back. If you really want to have regulation and not captured by industry, you have to get in when the industry is really in distress. So had they intervened early in 2009, would be a different game. But they waited, and by that time, for example, the industry distorted a lot of decisions. So let me make an example. I think that in the United States, there is a large demand for a separation between commercial and investment banking, what goes under the name of Glass-Steagall, because this was a law passed in 1933 to separate the two, and repeal in 1999. Now, we can discuss on which side you are of this debate. I actually decided recently that I'm the side that separation is better, but the fact is there was a large demand from the population to have that. The industry understood that, and the Obama administration understood that. Also understood that the industry did not want that at all. And so they created this so-called Volcker rule. What is the Volcker rule? First of all, the Volcker is named after Paul Volcker, who was like a Fed chairman in the late 70s, early 80s, a very respectable human being. So they gave him immediately a name that is hard to contend with. But if you look at the details of the law, it says that you can or cannot trade depend on your intent. Okay, now, intent is extremely difficult to detect. Maybe even with a fMRI, you can't tell intent of people. So this law is substantially not applicable and has not been implemented yet, and my guess will never be implemented. But it is a very good rule to make difficult for anybody else to enter. And in particular, in light of what I call the fintech revolution, I think the incumbents love many aspects of Dodd-Frank because makes sort of very costly for new entrant to play the game.
Okay, thanks. So what about Donald Trump? Donald Trump came into Washington promising to drain the swamp, if you like, smash up this system of corporate lobbying, which you believe has caused so much damage. Do you have any belief, any hope that he will actually achieve that in practice?
No, I have a lot of sympathy for the people who voted for Donald Trump, very little sympathy for Donald Trump himself. I think that he was very smart in interpreting a very strong resentment present in the population, and to some extent is a sign of the failure of the American system that the only person picking up this resentment was such a sort of a strange person, let's put it this way. But the resentment is real. Now, I look at a survey saying that 63% of the people who voted for Donald Trump recognize that Donald Trump does not have the competence to run the country. And they voted for him. What does that mean? It means that they're sick and tired of Washington. They really saw this as sending a powerful message, a wrecking ball in Washington to destroy Washington. Now, the risk is that in the process, we are destroying ourselves. So I think it's a pretty sort of act of desperation. And I think that that's what we need to interpret. And I think that also what we need to pay a lot of attention is why the system was not providing a reasonable candidate with those positions, and why it took somebody so out there to interpret this sentiment, which is very widespread. The idea of draining the swamp is the only thing that finds both Democrats and Republicans agreeing. Now, do we really think that somebody like Donald Trump is going to drain the swamp? I don't think so. In the sense, maybe because I lived for 20 years under Berlusconi, I sort of know that this is hard to do. And my fear is the damage that a person like this will leave to all the sort of pro-market movement in the country. I think that the identification between pro-market and pro-business is what destroyed the credibility of pro-market forces in Italy. And I fear that this is going to happen the same way in the United States.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to end with a couple of questions on economics as a discipline and its future before I open up to the audience. Now, firstly, what do you think of the way in which economics is developing as a discipline? And in particular, it's the mathematization of the subject. In fact, I believe that Chicago was the first university to abolish the compulsory requirement to study economic history, and of course has been in the vanguard of that mathematization of economics. How do you feel about the development of economics as a discipline?
First of all, Chicago tends to leave a lot of freedom to students, very much in the spirit of Chicago. So we have very few requirements, at least at the business school, we have minimal requirements, and I think that that's in line with our philosophy. So I'm not surprised we're the first one to abolish. I think that two things should not be put in contrast one with the other. In the sense, mathematics is a very useful tool, and is very useful to make things precise. Now, there is a trade-off between saying nothing precisely and precisely nothing. And I think that a lot of the literature, economic literature these days, is very much in the corner of saying precisely nothing. But it's not necessarily because of the use of mathematics, it's because sort of in academia, things tend to get narrower and narrower, and etc. I think that I very much like Hayek. They say an economist, to be a good economist, cannot be just an economist. I think that you need to know not only mathematics, but also psychology, sociology, history, and bring all these things together. I think that economics is a social science, so as the burden of being a science, but also the element of being social. And so understanding all the rest is extremely important, and if you don't do that, you're missing a big part of the picture.
So you really recommend that the students here would actually study more broadly than perhaps students tend to do very often. Would you recommend them an academic career?
I think that personally, I've been extremely lucky in my career. I dreamed to do that, and I overcame my dream in terms of realization. So in that sense, I wish to everybody to have what I had. And I think that I love studying, and so the academic career should be for everybody who loves studying. This said, I think that education is a sector up for dramatic change. If you think about it, is the only sector that did not have any major disruption or innovation. Except for PowerPoint, we teach the way Socrates used to teach. And I don't think PowerPoint adds very much to the game. So I think that if you think more broadly how to train 1 billion of Chinese and 1 billion of Indians, you cannot do it with PowerPoint and or Blackboard. You have to do it in a smarter, more cost-effective way. So I think that academia will go through a disruption, but there will be a lot of jobs, but will be different than the way they've been. So but I think that applies honestly to any job. I don't think that you should look at the past and say, I liked the job in the past, I'm going to do that in the future, because it's not going to be true. But there will be, I think that what I love of academia is the continuous research, the continual stimulation of your brain, of your curiosity, the continuous learning. And I think that that should be your Northern Star, no matter what job you do, because the future is that, after all, this is what gives still an edge to human beings versus machines.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. I was recently actually at the Acton Institute, and as Lord Acton said, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So let's open up to questions. I think we have 4 people around with a roving mic. So the gentleman right at the back with the white shirt. I've been asked to describe people because the mic holders have been struggling to identify
So
them.
you talked about draining of the swamp, and you also talked a bit about the European Union. Do you think there's any hope for reform of the euro, which brings so much misery to Southern Europe? Or do you think the best hope is just now to revert to previous currencies?
So this is a very difficult question, in the sense that I think that the euro has not been good for Southern Europe, in particularly for Italy. Might have been a reasonable bet at the time. I think that England was very smart not to enter, but for Southern European countries, might have been a reasonable bet. It turned out to be exposed a terrible outcome. However, it's a bit like Hotel California. You can check out at any time but never leave. And I think that is designed. This is the part that actually we should reflect very deeply, because in a sense is the result of the hubris of economists, because the euro was designed to be irreversible. There is a statement made by Chancellor Helmut Schmidt saying that the great things about the euro is that if you leave the euro, your country economy is destroyed. So it was designed in this way to make it credible. very much in the spirit of make a commitment the most credible possible. They never understood, or they did not want to anticipate the fact that maybe with some probability things turned out badly, and then what happened? To some extent, there is a continental European hubris in the Euro project. What I like of the British spirit is the empiricism and the idea that you try, you do, you're not absolutist in any dimension. And the Euro was an absolutist project, and it turns out not to be good. And I don't know how it's going to unfold.
Okay, gentleman at the back on this side in the pink jacket. And then I'll come to the front.
So you were talking a little bit about the disenfranchisement and leading to populism, and you were also talking about the academic environment. Do you feel that one of the reasons why there is this kind of failure to predict and address the needs of the general public is there's an academic bubble, and debate and dissent isn't as common among the current academic environment, so there's a disconnect between universities and the common people?
Yes, I think it's an important problem. It's not unique of academia, but it is also in academia. And I think is problematic. Now, I don't know enough to speak about the UK, but in the US, I think that there is a bit of a distortion due to the way everything is financed that makes sort of people become intellectual for hire rather than searchers for the truth. And I think that that disconnect is very dangerous and needs to be fixed. And I don't see sort of a lot of reaction to that. I think that one of the causes of what is called populism in reality is an elitism present in the entire sort of intellectual world. Whether you're a journalist or an academic, you tend to, I'm not saying everybody, and I would like to think I'm not part of that, but everybody would like to think to be different. But there is, in America, vis-a-vis the victory of Trump, there was a reaction that, it must be that there are these fake news, and that's the reason why Trump won, rather than saying Hillary was a terrible candidate, and nobody had the courage to say it aloud, and nobody had the courage to sort of present a reasonable alternative. And then people were desperate and went for desperate action. I think that there is a serious need to a reconsideration of academia, and also much more connection with what people fear. I think that think about globalization or Brexit. We benefit tremendously from globalization and Brexit. If I'm here today, it's part of globalization, otherwise I wouldn't. And so we're naturally supporter of that, and I think we should be supporter for some fundamental reasons, but we should also recognize that a lot of the benefits went to a small part of the population, and the ones who are left behind are complaining, and rightly so.
Okay, yeah, gentleman on the sort of inside left here. Right to the front, white t-shirt. Thanks.
Hello. You mentioned price discrimination at the start of your speech in terms of pharmaceuticals between the US and Canada. Do you believe that this price discrimination is necessarily a bad thing?
So do I believe that price discrimination is necessarily...
Yeah. In the sense of between US and Canada, do you believe it's necessarily a bad thing?
Is it necessarily a bad thing, the price discrimination between the US and Canada? That was the question.
For the drugs?
Yeah.
Yes, because since the only justification that they give is because they want to support more research, but it's not obvious why this research should be paid by the American consumers and not by the Canadian consumers. And it says, you can see why you want the richer countries to pay more for the research than the poorer countries, but it's not like Canada is particularly poor. So I think that it is simply a way to make the insurance company and indirectly consumers and indirectly the state pay much more for those drugs than in any other countries. Remember that a big chunk of the US healthcare is Medicare, which is the government. So this idea that is mostly private is kind of a myth, because what happens very often is you have the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. So insuring young people, which is very profitable, is left to the private sector. And then paying Medicare for the old people, which is the costly stuff, is left to the government. So it's not really a private system. It's a system where there is cream skimming, in which insurance companies get the best and the taxpayers get the worst deal.
Okay. Yeah, gentleman, second row in the check shirt.
Hi. Please, I'm from Brazil, a country that arguably has mastered crony capitalism.
You don't have a monopoly there.
Yeah. It seems to me that their political party's greatest reward is to dominate a massive state machine formed by almost 200 state companies, millions of civil servants, and various over-regulated markets. So there is no party offering a different path away from this structure. How do you think this permissive equilibrium can change?
So, first of all, let me give you sort of a word of hope. In a sense, Brazil, like Italy, is bad, but also I think that one of their characteristics is they're much more transparent in what they're doing than many other countries. So one of my favorite lines is the contribution of Berlusconi to humankind is to make it apparent and clear how much capture there is. Because in a sense, Berlusconi had a government where the member of the government were his employees defending the interests of his companies. So even if you are blind, you have to recognize that this is wrong. In the United States, is a little bit more distant in the sense you are an employee of a company just the second before you become Secretary of Treasury, and also the second after you're Secretary of Treasury. But during the time you're Secretary of Treasury, you're not employee of that company. Okay? And of course, you end up doing the interest of that company when you're Secretary of Treasury, but is less visible on the outside, and so generates less reaction, but is not that different. Okay, so Brazil is extreme and bad, but the United States, I'm saying something a bit outrageous, are not that much better. Okay, many of the things that are illegal in the United States, sorry, they are considered illegal in Brazil, are legal in the United States. I was listening to a presentation of a paper about Korea. You know, in Korea, they sent to jail 2 presidents, and they are about to send to jail a 3rd one. So in that sense, is not that far from Brazil. I was asking, so what did this president do? And one case is that one of the wife of one of the president was accumulating a huge amount of money for a personal foundation. I said, wait a minute, that's the Clinton Foundation. What difference is there? It's simply that in Korea it's illegal and you go to jail. In the United States, you're almost elected president.
Okay. Yeah, gentlemen, just come round to it sort of inside right, if you like. Second column, 3 rows forwards. Blue shirt, blue jacket. Keep going. That's right. Got it.
How have the views of the freshwater school changed since 2011 with regards to the effects of austerity on Greece in particular, since the days of Friedman? And second question, a few days ago the NBER published a paper on the adverse effects of the $15 minimum wage in Seattle. Around the same time, Minneapolis voted through the same rate for the minimum wage. Can we expect to see the same impact? And if so, how do we challenge this wave of economic populism that is going across the United States at the moment?
You could answer one question or the other, but not both. We like fair shares of questions, so I want to get one more in.
So on the first question, I think that it's a tricky thing because countries like Greece or Italy are wasting a huge amount of money in the public sector. So should they reduce that waste? Absolutely. Is the right thing to do to reduce this waste at the same time as everything else is going down the tube and aggregate demand is falling and interest rate is zero and we are sort of at a zero lower bound? No. Unfortunately, was the wrong medicine or maybe the right medicine at the wrong time. And here there is a responsibility of a lot of organizations, but including the IMF, that in particular in the case of Greece, said that the debt was sustainable in order to allow the bailout of German and French banks, when the debt was not sustainable, should have been sort of haircut right away, and the system in Greece would have been much, much better. So I think that the biggest problem of Greece is not necessarily the fact that they reduce some of the government expenditure that should have been reduced anyway, is the fact that the international system wanted to penalize them excessively without wanting to penalize who lended the money. It takes two to tango, and it takes a bad borrowers and the bad lenders. It's not obvious that all the costs should go to the borrower.
Thanks. I can see the heavy mob circling around the stage to boot me off, but I'm just going to ask if there's one more question. Yeah, gentleman with the glasses about 5 rows back and 5 columns in.
Thank you. So immediately after the Brexit vote, and indeed even a little bit before, we had a lot of companies who employ a lot of people in the UK threatening to move abroad, move jobs abroad if they didn't get access to the single market. But the government realised that probably wasn't politically feasible, and so started talking about other options, whether it be lower tax rates or something they said to Nissan that we still don't know, to try and incentivize them to stay. So in principle, do you think that kind of thing is a good idea? And if so, how do we prevent that from turning into the kind of regulatory capture that you talked about earlier?
That's an excellent question, because I should have said earlier when we were talking about the pluses and minuses of Europe, one of the things that Europe did right is precisely limiting this competition for subsidies that take place actually in the United States. In the United States, there is that beggar your neighbor in terms of tax subsidies that at the end of the day favors crony capitalism that is not particularly useful. So I understand that the UK now are in a weaker position and they are more easily blackmailable by these companies. Especially for the political repercussion, when you see a sort of a company relocating, there are political, not only economic, but also political repercussion. So I think they are particularly weak in that dimension, and they don't have the protection of the EU policy that say no sort of subsidies. So I think it's going to be much harder, and is one of the negative sides of Brexit.
Well, thank you very much, Luigi, for a magnificent tour de force on a whole range of subjects, but with this one unifying theme of crony capitalism, something which I think we on our side of the debate don't perhaps talk about as much as we should. And thank you also for some excellent questions. Thank you.